coming after a long list of very distinguished speakers, all of whom are probably more eminently qualified to speak to you than I am. So from that point of view, I'm actually going to go in a little bit of a different direction and at least try to take something that I do know about, which is the nature of innovation, and talk to you a little bit about what it is about innovation that can be leveraged to help Florida in developing its economic development strategy for the future. Speaking in particular about what's going to happen as the NASA manned space program changes, but also in general about how the economy as a whole is changing, and maybe something about what your role in that new economy can be. So economic dislocations like the shift in the NASA manned spaceflight program are very disruptive. They are highly uncertain and at times even scary. And I regret to tell you that there is very little that can be done to mitigate those characteristics. These dislocations will always be scary. They will always be uncertain. There are things that government can do to try to help manage the economy's way through these shifts. But as we've seen in past experiences, from the globalization of manufacturing in the 1980s to the defense drawdown in the 1990s, past experience has told me that there are a lot of interventions that government can try to do, but they actually don't have a very good track record of success, unfortunately. However, I don't want to come across as a modern-day Cassandra predicting all about doom and gloom. I think that we have, in fact, learned a lot of things from past experience, and that there are things that the state of Florida as a whole can do to try to ease this transition. And there are a lot of ways that you can maybe try to frame the problem into thinking about how you could actually turn what could be interpreted as a crisis, but instead turn it into an opportunity. My overall advice is that in this kind of a situation with this degree of uncertainty, the best policy to take is to follow policies and programs that have modest goals at first with maximum flexibility, to take advantage of the opportunity to learn as you go along, and to really try to look at how the economy unfolds and make sure that you have sufficient feedback loops in what policies you propose so that you can actually change as things go along, and those things that are successful get reinforced and given greater resources while you learn to let go of failures very quickly. I think in this kind of time in particular, leadership needs to be both simultaneously bold and humble. Bold in the sense that you really need to look at developing a vision for the future that can really try to take advantage of the change you're undergoing and think about really questioning your own assumptions and trying to find a new way forward, but also humble in the realization that failures are inevitable in this kind of a situation, and that therefore we really need to take advantage of our ability to learn from our failures in order to find the right path forward. So just so you know a little bit about where I'm from and why I should be qualified to talk about this, I'm from SRI International. We are not one of those three-letter agencies in Washington, D.C. I don't do anything related to national security myself. SRI actually used to be called the Stanford Research Institute, so we are a spin-off from Stanford University. We've been around for pretty close to a little over 50 years. And we do a lot of actual research and development. So we have 5 divisions that do work in areas like biotechnology development. We do a lot of work on energy systems. We develop solutions to protect troops from improvised explosive devices in the field. So we try to think of ourselves as a think tank, but also a can-do tank. We're trying to develop actual solutions to actual problems. We recently opened a facility in St. Petersburg here in Florida and actually have a fairly long history of involvement in the Florida region. The St. Petersburg group is doing a lot of work on marine homeland security issues, port security, maritime technology. I'm actually from the policy division, which is based in Washington, D.C., and we study what are the economic and social implications of technical change, and in particular, what are the implications of technology for regional economic development. And my particular area is looking at a lot of workforce issues. So we've done a number of studies here in the Florida region involving how to strengthen Florida's innovation system and innovation economy. When I do these kinds of talks, I like to start with a couple of quotes just to kind of frame your thinking about the topic. So the first one of these is from the computer scientist John von Neumann, who said that there's no point in being precise if you don't even know what you're talking about. And I can tell you that coming from Washington, D.C., I'm from a town where there are many people who are being very precise about things they know nothing about. So I've seen this in action. But what I think this quote really tries to tell you is that it's much better to gather data first and then draw your conclusions rather than the other way around. And there's a very natural tendency in human nature to try to jump to the conclusion and then figure out what the supporting evidence is. I think this also instructs us that it's a mistake to be too confident in your own assumptions unless you know that there's empirical foundations for your beliefs. So this is why, of course, as a researcher, maybe I'm biased, but I think that it is definitely in our best interest to think very carefully about what the situation really is, to collect information about what the nature of our situation is first, and then try to decide what the course of action should be after that. My next quote is from a famous American philosopher who's very profound. His name is Yogi Berra. He said, "You've got to be careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there." So again, I think that what Yogi Berra is trying to tell us is that if you don't have an idea of your final goal, then chances are very likely you'll end up in someplace completely different than what you thought you were going to do. But in the nature of innovation is kind of curious, because notice that Yogi Berra doesn't say if you don't know where you're going, then don't go anywhere, right? He's not telling us that we should avoid the journey. He's saying that if you don't know where this journey is going to lead you, you've got to be careful. But there's a lot of innovation that you see in the private sector and the public sector that fails because people were too afraid to take the chance to start on that journey, even though they didn't know what the end point would be. And therefore, they never got around to actually inventing or creating the kinds of things that they were trying to get to in the first place. So I think that what this really tells you is, again, it pays to be careful, it pays to think ahead, but in the absence of having a clear vision of where you're going, it's still very worth it to give it a shot. I'll give you a couple of cases of how this actually worked in practice at SRI. Anybody have an idea what this is? Anybody? Shout it out. Right, this is the original computer mouse. This was developed by Doug Engelbart at SRI. This is he actually got the patent for this in 1967. So the mouse has actually been around for more than 40 years, believe it or not. This mouse design was actually patented, and the license was sold to Apple in 1980, 13 years after invention. Steve Jobs figured out what this might be good for. And what I think is especially instructive is that SRI basically charged Apple $50,000 for the right to use the mouse in a computer, which has now revolutionized the industry and everybody here probably has used a mouse at some point in their life, right? So it gives you an idea that even though we are theoretically innovation experts, we may not have a very good idea of what it is that is the value of what we're inventing when the invention actually comes along. It also tells you a little bit about the incubation period for some of these ideas. It takes a very long time for things to come to fruition. This is actually a laboratory log notebook. This is a log from 1969 of the very first internet transmission. This is the first packet data transmission between UC Los Angeles and SRI's campus in Menlo Park. So the internet itself, the thing on which Facebook operates, YouTube, Google, which is Google also, Yahoo, actually itself originated in 1969. The first internet message, just so you know, was a message that said, "You failed to reach your host destination." So it was an error message. That was the first message that was transmitted over the internet. Okay. So what does this tell us? I think this tells us a lot about the very difficult nature of innovation and how tough it is, again, to really think about what it is we're trying to get done, how we're going to get there, and the fact that we're going to run into a lot of failures along the way, but that still means we should give it a shot. So I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that Florida faces when it comes to reconfiguring its system for innovation, especially after the NASA changes. I'll talk a little bit about Florida's post-shuttle economy, and especially what might be a new framework for thinking about that economy that is maybe not so dependent upon the manned spaceflight program, or that integrates the new manned spaceflight program, but in very different ways. In my experience, again, when you're undergoing a tremendous economic shift, It pays to even think about how you go about analyzing your economy and how you actually characterize your own economy, because you want to make sure that you go back to first principles and see if your assumptions still are correct or not. And I'll leave you with a few thoughts about how you can align strategies for a near-term recovery, which everybody's obviously very nervous about now, how to get jobs growing today, but make sure that it still feeds into the long-term competitiveness of the state economy. I think we all need to have a starting point if we're going on this journey, and so therefore at least taking some tentative first steps is a good idea for all of us. So when it comes to reconfiguring a regional innovation system, this in fact is a very complicated thing to do. It's definitely different. It's not simply what the Bible calls pouring new wine into an old bottle, because often the old bottle will break, right? The first thing you have to understand is that when it comes to how innovation occurs, in Florida, just as in any other region, your innovation abilities are embedded in your institutions. It's your universities, it's your government laboratories and agencies, it's your private corporations, it's your incubators. Now, Florida's institutions have evolved over time, and in particular, they have evolved around the space program, around a certain set of assumptions about where NASA was going and what they were going to do. So now that a lot of those basic environmental characteristics have changed, it's important to realize that you're really going to need to see some institutions change and become more flexible and maybe adopt a completely new approach to the market or to their environment in order to fully leverage the opportunities that this crisis affords you. This also means that it will require new kinds of partnerships, which again is an area I've studied quite a bit. How do you engender collaboration, especially among institutions that often did not have a history of collaboration, or in many cases, their interaction might have even been somewhat hostile or at least unfriendly. I've done a lot of studies of technology transfer from universities like this one to private corporations. It is not a path that's been strewn with rose petals. There have always been conflicts about how do you value inventions, how do you negotiate licensing agreements, how do you really take something invented in a lab that a professor thought was a really neat scientific principle, but turn that into something that's useful to you in everyday life. So it basically means that you may have to think about ways when you're employed in an institution, how you might be able to contribute to changing that institution so that it's more open to those kind of partnerships. Another factor is that cultural barriers are going to impede any efforts at reform. There was a study that was done in California in the late 1990s looking at the drawdown in the aerospace industry there, mostly related to defense, and trying to get all those aerospace engineers to work in the electronics industry, which, for most of us seems like a no-brainer, right? I mean, these folks were very highly trained. They knew the electronics. They were used to developing products that had extremely high quality, high degree of performance they had to meet, perfect for an industry like semiconductors or computer electronics and manufacturing or medical electronics. It turned out that almost none of those former aerospace engineers got hired by the private sector. And why is that? It turned out that when it came time for the actual hiring decisions, these electronics companies, that were the high-tech companies in California that were used to moving very quickly, used to a highly uncertain environment, found that the former aerospace engineers had no clue how to operate under those kinds of conditions. In the defense aerospace sector, the engineers were very accustomed to having very standardized requirements that the Defense Department had given them, that they weren't allowed to change, and they knew that they had to meet certain level of quality and performance regardless of the cost. In a commercial environment, they really had no clue what to do. And any ones that were hired by these electronics companies very quickly washed out. So when we're talking about what it takes to reskill an economy or to prepare your workforce for a new economy, it's more than just the content of what you know and your knowledge and the coursework you've taken. A lot of it is also about attitude and what are going to be the more interpersonal requirements, what's going to be more characteristics almost psychologically that you're going to have to bring with you in order to succeed in this kind of new environment. The final piece of bad news I will deliver, well, it may not be the final one, but at least it's close, is that the problem is that systems that evolve organically tend to resist attempts at top-down restructuring. And again, the way that innovation has come about and the space sector has come about in Florida has been for the most part, organic. I mean, NASA set certain requirements, they set up certain programs, but you had companies and universities and research institutes that grew up around the space program in that particular context, often just because they were responding to what NASA was telling them and responding to the environment. So for somebody to come in and say, okay, great, well now there's a new reality, there's a new funding situation, there's a new set of requirements, and everybody's going to be expected to turn on a dime and adapt themselves to this new situation. It's not going to happen, right? You're going to have to think about ways that you can actually try to intervene in a more organic fashion at the ground level with some experimentation, with a lot of failure, not really knowing necessarily what the final outcome is going to be of what you try. But again, actually try to create an organic form of change within the state of Florida's economy and within your own part in the state of Florida's economy, so that you can actually try to figure out a better way of operating in this new environment. So when I look at a regional economy like the state of Florida, or any region for that matter, and I'm trying to think about what is the role of industrial innovation and economic change and growth and how that economy is going to succeed, I think it's very helpful to look at this as a portfolio of capabilities. And I believe one of the previous speakers, several of them have talked about this idea of industry clusters. What are going to be the clusters of the future, right? Where are the jobs going to be? Where are we going to see the greatest amount of growth? Well, it's important to realize that not all clusters are created equal. And some are more equal than others. And some are going to be evolving along a certain pathway that's going to be different from others. But really where the strength of an economy comes is in its ability to ride out the waves that come from disruption because you have diversified sufficiently to manage the amount of risk that you're facing. So a simple way to look at this is to take a look at your region and say, well, we have certain advantages in areas, right? We have capability in electronics. We have a lot of really great health technology that comes from the idea of you got to support a person living in an environment with no atmosphere and no gravity. So we have those capabilities here. They might be embedded in the workforce. They might be embedded in laboratories. They might be embedded in the technologies we know how to deal with. Are those, in fact, aligned with where the market is going? So you do have to think about the world outside of your own region. Are you going to be selling into that market? What are the demands of that market? What are the demands of those customers? Are you really responding to what those customers are going to be asking for in the future when your old customer was just a monolithic agency that you pretty much were able to negotiate with them about what their requirements were? So in this kind of situation, any economy has, again, multiple industry clusters, but they might be at different points in their life cycle. At the bottom, you'll see here, you could have an emerging cluster that's just getting started. You don't have a lot of necessarily great competitive advantage compared to other regions like Silicon Valley, like Austin, Texas, like Minneapolis, Minnesota in medical devices, like China or India. But at least you have some potential for there to be growth, both in your own capability and in where the market is going. So in the best case scenario, you take these emerging clusters and you help to invest in them to grow them to become stars where you have both high market growth and competitive advantage, right? And as those markets mature and the technologies become more well-known and the players become more established, you'll find that those clusters will start to mature themselves and perhaps go into a period of at least somewhat decline. Right, the growth phase is going to be gone. You're going to see lower levels of increasing revenue. But what's important is that those industries then become the cash cows of the future. So those mature industries are the ones that are generating the capabilities, generating the people, generating the money that you can then go back and invest in the next generation of emerging clusters. So when you're trying to think about where you're aiming to be in the economy, don't just think about where the economy is today, think about where that economy is going. And think about how am I going to be able to manage my own career, my own position in the economy across all of these different potential options I have so that I can actually be able to take advantage of this wave or this life cycle that's coming in the economy. So one way where we see this a lot is in looking at how knowledge and talent support that diversification. So again, when I'm looking at a region's workforce and what role the workforce is going to play in innovation, you can take a look at all of these different industry clusters, and you know that those clusters have certain opportunities, they have skill requirements, they have jobs that are going to be opening up that need to be filled, right? And those are matched by certain kinds of talent and knowledge domains that are going to be characteristics of the employees that are going to fill those positions. But again, any talent pool is not monolithic. We're all different. We all have our different capabilities, and the industries have their own different requirements and different capabilities that they demand. And so you'll see that when it comes to the occupations of the future, you're going to see a diversification in the creation of new kinds of jobs, or in the relative importance of different jobs that are going to be somewhat, some are going to be more desirable than others, but they're all going to play different roles in this diversified economy. Now, it's a truism which has been somewhat debunked, but it is still somewhat true, that every American worker is going to go through 7 career changes throughout their lifetime. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but I can say for certain that almost every industry that is successful today will at some point become mature. And most people I know, at my age, have been through at least 2 or 3 industries by the time they're in the middle of their career. And again, they'll probably their career will take them into several different industry clusters as they evolve over time. So what's really going to be important in the future is to have a portfolio of skills yourself that enables you to play a role in multiple industries and multiple segments of the economy. And what's especially important, I think, is that this idea that, again, you're trying to arbitrage across different industries. You want to be involved maybe on the emerging wave at one point, but maybe you can be transition into a more mature industry if you want more stability in your life, more stability in your job environment, and then maybe go back and rejoin the emerging economy when you're ready to do so. So this idea again of thinking about how do career life cycles align with industry life cycles and economic life cycles. Those are, I think, very important considerations to keep in mind. So, given that, this really speaks to the idea that we need a new kind of framework for thinking about what's going to lead to economic growth in the future and how is Florida going to succeed. And I have, as somebody who works in economics, the required extremely complicated chart with a lot of buzzwords on it. But really the idea here is very simple, despite the complexity of the illustration. Around the outside, you'll see this life cycle in terms of what kinds of characteristics you need to work on in your policies in order to ensure that you have a thriving and sustainable, successful economy. So it takes a lot of solid economic foundations. We need to have the workforce. We need to have finance and capital availability. We need to have good infrastructure. We need to have good quality of life to make sure we can attract the right kinds of workers to this region, or the right kinds of students who will become future workers, right? That will all help to ensure a higher quality of life. But quality of life is predominantly determined by what's your standard of living. And your standard of living is predominantly determined by productivity and your success in industry. And your success in industry and productivity is determined by your competitive advantage, your industry clusters. So you can see that cycle around the outside is really trying to depict, I think, a common way of looking at your industry, which is that you have multiple clusters. As long as you have a solid base on which to build them, then they can help sustain the quality of life in your region and sustain the quality of jobs in your region. Because really this comes down to quality of the kinds of employment that we're going to have here in the state of Florida. I had a client ask me very recently for a project I'm working on, is the point of economic policy to have a diversified economy, or is it to have more jobs? And obviously in today's environment, people are more interested in having more jobs, and they don't necessarily care how they get there. But my message to you is that you do have to worry about both. You can have more jobs, but if they're low-wage, low-skill jobs, chances are they're going to be very easily offshored to another country or automated out of existence. And then you have to think about a whole new way of employing all of those workers who were trained to do a certain class of jobs that are no longer available. So really when it comes to thinking strategically about what's going to happen here in Florida, especially after the massive drawdown, you really do need to think a lot about what are going to be the types of high-quality jobs that are going to be available to workers, and I'm talking about workers in all different areas and at all different levels of education. Another thing I see very often happening throughout this country that I believe is a mistake is that there is a lot of focus on university graduates as being the key segment of the workforce. Now, I'm not saying that you made a mistake by coming to university. Okay? University education is by far one of the best investments that you can make. But the fact of the matter is, in any economy, there are going to be some people who go to university, there are going to be some people who don't. They're all going to play critical roles in this economy, and we need to be thinking strategically about making sure that we have career paths that are going to serve as much of the population, as much of the working population as possible. So that's a lot of what goes into the interior of this pyramid, this idea of diversification, of having different kinds of industries with different career paths. For example, I'm working in the area of renewable energy and energy efficiency. You're going to need to have people who can install solar panels, not just invent and design them. You're going to need to have people who know how to service electric cars, not just build them and get them, create a factory for them. So really, again, I think this means on a very large scale, in terms of a broad picture, we need to be thinking very carefully about what's going to be the composition of our economy and how can we make sure that everybody who's a player in that economy is going to get something out of it, that they're going to get the kind of return they need to ensure that they have a better quality of life. So the final thing I said I was going to talk about is aligning near-term and long-term goals, and how do you go about doing that? And again, here I go back to my experience in looking at innovation in a lot of environments, in corporate R&D laboratories, in universities, in government laboratories, and fundamental research institutes. And the thing is that successful innovation occurs in environments where there is a positive approach to failure, where people actually see failure as being not necessarily a negative, but actually a learning opportunity. And in particular, one where people are used to placing a lot of small bets across a wide range of options and seeing which ones pay off and which ones don't, and then having the ability to shift their investments to those options that turn out to be the best ones in terms of the reward. So to foster innovation, you're better off by starting small, by failing as quickly as possible, and then by paying attention to what lessons you learned in failure. So, a lot of, again, this economic analysis that I tend to do looks at this idea of industry clusters. But if you look at a cluster like financial services, that's actually an industry so broad you could drive a truck through it. I mean, I used to work in financial services. You have commercial banking, you have retail banking, you have corporate treasury, you have securities, you have fixed income assets. It means all kinds of things. So really when it comes down to defining where are you going to find the growth in that cluster, the opportunity in that cluster, you have to get a lot more granular, you have to get a lot more specific, and you have to think about how are global trends and how are broad economic changes affecting the nature of that industry and going to create advantage in certain segments versus others. So for example, one area I look at was, as mentioned earlier, this idea of financial clearinghouses. As we have huge volumes of trades going on in the financial markets, and those trades are being done on a global scale, the ability to have extremely highly reliable transaction mechanisms and technologies, and people who know that if you make a small mistake in terms of a half of a second being late in executing a trade can cost you $1 million, right? You're talking about environments with a very low tolerance for variability. That's a certain kind of financial technology that you don't find in very many places. And again, there are places here in Florida where you do find that. For example, I'm doing a large-scale project in the Tampa Bay region, and Tampa recently got a facility for a company called the Depository Trust and Clearing Company, which probably you've never heard of, but this is the company that actually processes every single trade done on the New York Stock Exchange. Right? Extremely important responsibility. And they have their main processing center in Brooklyn. But of course, after 9/11, we learned that having more facilities in Manhattan is probably not the best idea. And so when they went around trying to find where their hot backup site would be, where they were going to have the secondary facility that if the first one goes down, the second one can take over within a second later, they chose the Tampa region for that. So again, you really need to think about those kinds of opportunities that are within those industry clusters and try to figure out, again, what it is about the nature of the market, the nature of the world that's going to make those specific niches much better. It also means that when you're looking across the entire economy, it's better to make a number of seed investments to support multiple programs with different characteristics instead of laying down big bets. Right? So you really want to look at how is this economy going to promote a lot of different kinds of ideas on starting up activity in many clusters. And again, I think this idea of having multiple clusters is clearly the way to go. But it's important not to put all your eggs in one basket and not to depend just on the space program or just on pharmaceuticals as being the way forward. You've got to really try to see if you can make multiple investments across a larger portfolio, at least to begin with. So what this really says to me is that don't try to plan on, again, spending your entire career in one industry necessarily. Don't try to think that the entire economy is going to be held up by one or two pillars. Really try to think about ways that you can encourage a combination of entrepreneurship and also helping established companies to try to exploit a lot of different opportunities simultaneously. Another thing that bothers me a little bit about the conversation in Washington today is that there's a lot of emphasis on small business and entrepreneurship, which I believe is extremely critical to why the United States has been successful in the past 40 years. But there is a role for larger companies and more established corporations because they are often the market into which startups and small businesses sell. So again, we need to look at this more systemically and systematically and look again at the distributional structure of our economy and of our industries to make sure that we have the right balance. Okay? And my final message is that if we're going to be successful in the future, we need to look at how we can grow new capabilities organically and not necessarily on pre-planned reskilling. So I'm all in favor of certificate programs, for example. I think they're very useful. And if you're going into the job market, I can tell you that in certain professions and in certain careers, certification is now the way that employers really determine who's going to get an interview or not. So I can tell you that if you want to go into project management at a professional level, you do have to take the Project Management Institute's evaluation test so you can become a professional project manager, PMP certification. A lot of times now that people are applying for jobs over the web, your resume goes into a resume processing system that looks for specific keywords related to the position you're applying to. And if those keywords don't appear on your resume, your resume just gets deleted. And you don't hear back from the employer about it. So that's one thing to think about is that there are definitely cases in the new economy where specific employers are looking for specific new capabilities. You need to understand what those capabilities are and in real time what it is that people are going to look at when they're trying to determine if you're qualified, even as an applicant. So the problem we have is that if we try to set up all kinds of formal retraining programs and try to think ahead about, well, we're going to take a bunch of people who are aerospace engineers and turn them into manufacturing engineers for renewable energy, we have a long history of failure in doing this. And it's very difficult to really be able to predict that certain kinds of employees who are good in one kind of job are necessarily going to be able to transfer all of their skills and abilities into another job very quickly. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this problem of cultural barriers, this problem of trying to achieve realignment, it's all very complicated, and therefore it might be best to allow people to kind of organically move towards those jobs where they feel most qualified and be able to provide them with the support they need to choose the best path towards retraining rather than immediately thinking that we know best about where they should best be placed for their future jobs. I think in terms of the space program in particular, we need to really think very hard about what we can do to promote entrepreneurship and what it takes to be an entrepreneur. I'm involved in a couple of different programs in Washington, D.C. that are involved in entrepreneurial education. I can tell you right now, nobody really knows very well what makes a good entrepreneur. We can look at people who are successful in entrepreneurship and find characteristics that are common among them. If you look at Bill Gates or you look at Mark Zuckerberg or people like that, you can see some things that are common to them, but figuring out how to train people to have those characteristics is extremely complex. But I think it is important to think about how you can try to instill cultural change, especially if these are people who are coming out of institutions that are not accustomed to changing very rapidly or with a lot of flexibility, and really try and find what are the opportunities to figure out how they can choose their own path most effectively. One of my friends who runs a foundation dedicated to entrepreneurial education puts it very well, that the real value of entrepreneurship is that it gives the employee control of their own career, right? You don't have to depend on somebody signing your paycheck necessarily if you know that a lot of what you're doing is due to your own effort and due to you defining your own job and your own position. And I think this is extremely important, and I believe this is true including if you go to work for another employer, that a lot of employers today are looking for people who are entrepreneurial, who are able to take control of their own destiny and really find out how to redefine their jobs, because there are all kinds of jobs that are popping up today that don't show up in our occupational statistics that I look at. I mean, there are jobs related to healthcare records, electronic records management. For example, being able to analyze large quantities of healthcare records to determine what are the causes of diseases and what are the linkages between conditions and disease appearing in the population. So these are jobs that didn't exist 5 years ago, right? And there's no way that the Department of Labor is going to be able to track those jobs and how they're evolving and where they're going. We're just never going to be good enough and fast enough and have enough real-time data to do that. But that's the kind of thing you're going to need to do in your careers. So the final thing to remember is that we also have to be in a mode where we are constantly reinventing ourselves. I think it's a very common saying, and I think it's quite true, that the world is accelerating, technology is changing at ever faster rates. I look at my father, who is 83 years old, and the amount of technical change that has occurred in his lifetime is probably going to be roughly equivalent to what's going to happen in 10 years of our lifetimes. So you think about new modes of transportation, new modes of energy generation, new modes of communication and interaction. There really is a strong case to be made for the fact that there are going to be a lot of skills that you learn today in college that are going to be obsolete within 5 or 10 years. So we really need to have the foundations of a system that enable lifetime learning, that enable reinvention and redefinition of jobs and characteristics and occupations, that we really need to be very sensitive to the fact that things that worked today are not going to work 5 or 10 years from now. And we need to have a system in place to detect when they're not working and be able to shut them down and try something new. So hopefully this gives you some ideas about ways to rethink where the economy is going, what the state of Florida can do, the way that the NASA drawdown is not necessarily something to be feared, but something that can at least make you go through a very healthy process of rethinking your assumptions about what's a successful career, what's a growth industry, where should we be placing our bets in the future. And in particular, to think about, even at an individual level, what are going to be the kinds of characteristics of that economy of the future that you want to promote, that you want to play a part in, and that you want to be able to execute when you choose your career of choice. So I think the long-term message is that as long as we maintain a healthy attitude of humility and being able to accept failures when they occur and that things are not always going to work out, but always to be able to accept that risk with the caveat that at least we can take something forward and learn our lessons, then we will all be much better positioned to pursue policies that are wise and that are going to lead to sustainable and healthy economic growth and prosperity.
Your experience in your research, you've obviously dealt with or reviewed a lot of regions who've gone through problems with industries change and all that. Can you give us an example of a successful region and how they successfully retooled themselves?
Well, again, I mean, having grown up in the Bay Area and gone to Stanford, that's, I think, a very obvious case that I can draw on from personal experience. I graduated from Stanford at a time when actually the Silicon Valley economy was actually in a very bad shape. There were no jobs. I actually left Silicon Valley because there were no job opportunities for somebody with a technical background. And it wasn't just a matter, I think, of I mean, definitely Silicon Valley benefited from the dot-com boom, and there's always some element of serendipity involved in these cases. But I actually read a good article recently it was a blog post that was entitled "Chance Favors Networked Mind," which is that if an opportunity comes along, the more connections you have and the more interconnections there are between institutions, the more likely it is that you can find the right combination of capabilities to take advantage of that opportunity to act on it quickly and build competitive advantage. I think Silicon Valley did that in the case of the internet, in that they had a lot of these, again, solid economic foundations. They had a strong venture capital community. They had a strong technical workforce. But they were moving away from hardware-based innovation to more software-based innovation. And people were willing and flexible enough to accept that change and to take advantage of it. And also, a lot of the institutions had a very healthy relationship with one another. They were able to spot those kinds of opportunities coming up and create new research centers, create new joint research projects, develop new education programs in the universities to help, again, leverage that. So it's a lot to do with, I think, this idea that if your region is able to work together and have the right working relationship among institutions, then you have a much better likelihood of managing through that transition.
You mentioned that you work with renewable energy. I was just curious to get your thoughts. Do you think it's possible for the United States to switch from oil to natural gas the way People Pickens was promoting? Do you think that's viable for us?
Having looked at the statistics, I have to say I am probably not as bullish on renewable energy as a lot of people, but I think that it's going to play a critical role in the economy of the future. If you look at the fossil fuels, coal and oil in particular, they're extremely embedded in our infrastructure. I mean, again, if you look at electric vehicles, one of the huge, the most, I think, significant constraints on the growth of electric vehicles is the lack of charging stations. And even though you can run some of them off of household outlets, most of them require a 220-volt outlet. So this idea that we're going to get rid of oil en masse, or especially get rid of coal en masse, and move to renewable sources like wind or solar, I think that it will happen because it has to happen. And I think that the technical advantages of renewable in terms of efficiency are very, very favorable. But it's not going to be a very rapid process. In particular, one thing to keep in mind, especially when it comes to looking at the move from coal-generated electricity to other sources of power like natural gas or wind or solar, is again, this, you probably heard it before, but we don't have a grid infrastructure to deliver that power from where it's going to be generated in wind farms or solar farms to the populated cities right now. So there's still a lot of work to be done on that infrastructural side of getting the right foundation so that we can actually shift the economy and the energy mix of the economy to that. Thank you very much.